Start in just a second, folks. Great, thanks. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to By the Numbers, a look at evaluating how China and Taiwan perform in country indexes. Welcome to everybody who's joining us here today in person and to those of you who are joining us online. My name is Andrew Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise here in Washington, D.C. And it's really my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's interesting panel, because this is a unique event in my experience in Washington, as we've got some really important institutions sharing the same stage. We've got the World Bank, Freedom House, the Heritage Foundation, the Atlantic Council, and finally my own organization, CIPE, sitting at one table. And I think this represents both the importance and seriousness of the topic we're looking at today. That's trying to understand the nature of prosperity and its relation to governance in China and Taiwan. Each of these institutions here today is pushing it in its own way for better governance, increased social and economic inclusion, and a healthier and wealthier world. You know, last week I was in Taipei, and I had the pleasure of meeting a very high-level member of the Taiwanese government, and she related to me her feeling that Taiwan's success in the semiconductor world could have only happened because it was a well-governed democracy. I also happened to meet with lots of major industrialists in the country, and they reinforced the idea and agreed that Taiwan's system of governance provided the rule of law, intellectual freedom, and social flexibility to innovate, grow, and promote investment. They were also clear in their sentiment that such conditions did not exist in China to the same extent, much to its disadvantage. Now, while those opinions were subjective, it's important to note that this event today is focused on the numbers we can see coming out of both China and Taiwan. This panel is not operating on feelings like my colleagues in Taiwan were, but data to every extent possible. And as noted in the financial press, including the Financial Times and elsewhere, the number and quality of economic data coming out of China is getting scarcer due to new data security requirements. This lack of data is making all of our jobs more difficult, especially for those of us who want to engage in a good faith analysis of what's going on. Opacity brings about misunderstandings and miscalculations about intent and direction of policy and economies. Communication, not misinformation, must regain the upper hand in dialogue and analysis on so many issues, but especially those around China and Taiwan. And each of our institutions here today on stage is committed to engaging in a good faith dialogue on issues at the intersections of markets and democracy. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them today, especially their observations and the conclusions that we might be able to draw as a group from them. So once again, I want to thank you and welcome you for joining us, and it's now my pleasure to turn things over to David Schulman, who's the Senior Director of the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council, who will guide us through today's discussions. David?
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be moderating this event today. I think we couldn't be having an event like this at a more perfect time, just on the heels of China concluding its 20th Party Congress, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the once every 5 years all-important political event in China. And this year, we marked Xi Jinping only deepening and centralizing further his control over the Chinese party state. And now he has power really that is unrivaled since the times of Mao Zedong. But I think what is less commented on is that Xi Jinping's work report, which the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party gives traditionally at the beginning of every party congress, really underscored that China is going to stick to the path that we've seen China following under Xi Jinping thus far. And that's unfortunate, because what that means is that China is going to continue doubling down on its statist approach both to the economy and to political repression inside China. No signs of a repeal of China's very strict zero COVID policies, which have contributed to repression as well as to slowing growth in China. And at the same time, Xi Jinping was reiterating hardline policies toward Taiwan about the need to drive towards so-called peaceful reunification, with Taiwan, including using force if needed to achieve that end, and stressing more than before the opposition to foreign interference in the Taiwan issue. And I think we can interpret that fairly broadly. Xi Jinping has many concerns about stepped-up U.S. and international support for Taiwan and what it could mean in the event of a crisis in Taiwan and the Strait. But one of those concerns is undoubtedly the growing affinity for and calls for deeper ties with Taiwan in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, based partly on the fact that at a time when the PRC is sadly going in the wrong direction and is increasingly promoting a vision of a tech-enabled means for liberal leaders to better control and censor and repress their own people, Taiwan is offering a vision of a thriving and prosperous Chinese democracy with a government that is a leader in using technology to bolster government effectiveness and its capacity to deliver for its own citizens. And this is a really stark difference, and I think it's one that China does not come out looking good in the comparison between the two. But happily, as Andrew just said, you don't have to take my or anyone's word for it. We have data. And the beauty of today's event is that we're looking at data-driven quantitative measures to compare how China and Taiwan deliver for their own citizens. Now, some out there are going to prefer one index to another. They're going to quibble potentially with the nature of the methodologies used in some of these indexes. But that's the point of an event like this, right, is to have opportunities for the authors of these indexes to present their findings, to explain their approach, and to offer opportunities for the audience to probe and to ask questions about how we got to these conclusions. So we're going to allow ample time at the end for audience questions at the second half of the event. But before we get to that, I'm going to introduce this excellent panel that we have and then turn it over to each of them to offer initial remarks. So first, I'll introduce Sarah Cook, who's Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She directs the Beijing's Global Media Influence Project, oversees the China Media Bulletin, and has been the author of country reports for Freedom House's annual publications, including Freedom in the World, and was part of the team that created the Freedom on the Net Index. We also have, to my left here, Anthony Kim. He's a research fellow and editor of the Index of Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. He focuses on a range of foreign policy issues, including those related to economic freedom, entrepreneurship, and investment. Thea Trumbik is the manager of the Women, Business, and the Law Project at the World Bank. Eric Hans leads the Center for Accountable Investment at the Center for International Private Enterprise, which consolidates CIPE's work on corrosive and constructive capital worldwide. And last but not least, Dan Negrea leads the Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council, which produces freedom and prosperity indexes that we'll discuss today. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah to offer her initial remarks.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, I apologize that I couldn't be there in person, but it looks like there's a nice little setup where I kind of virtually seem to be on stage next to Dan there, so that's pretty good. I'll start, in my time today, I'll do two things. One is just introduce Freedom in the World, which is the main index assessing political rights and civil liberties that Freedom House produces every year, and then dive into some of the numbers on China and Taiwan, as Dan mentioned. So as many of you know, Freedom House is a US-based nonprofit, and we're dedicated to promoting democracy, human rights, and freedom around the world through a combination of analysis, advocacy, and support for frontline human rights defenders. And I, of course, work on our research team. So what is Freedom in the World? Well, Freedom in the World is Freedom House's annual assessment of political rights and civil liberties, and it's really global. It assesses 195 countries and 15 territories, and it's actually been doing that for almost 50 years. Next year is going to be the 50th anniversary. The report is composed of both numerical ratings, which I'll focus on, but also descriptive texts that explain the reasons for the particular scores that a country receives on a certain indicator. So you can find those on our website. And the methodology is derived in large part from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But Freedom in the World, I think a lot of people think of it as assessing governments. It's actually very much focused on the real world rights and freedoms enjoyed by individuals within that territory. So obviously governments play a role in that, but so do non-state actors within a particular territory, as well as, of course, foreign governments or foreign actors from outside. So what do we look at? Well, there are 8 categories divided into political rights and civil liberties. Under political rights, each country is assessed under indicators for electoral process, political pluralism and participation, and the functioning of government, including transparency and accountability for corruption. Under civil liberties, we look at freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, including labor rights, the rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual rights, including women's rights. In total, there are 25 indicators, and each one is worth a maximum of 4 points, so you get a nice, neat score out of 100. The way we do our collect the data is maybe, I think, different from some other surveys in that it's not really a survey per se, it's based on expert analysis. We have expert analysts, many of them located in the countries, providing a preliminary assessment using a combination of on-the-ground research, consultations with local contacts, and other available information from both governmental and non-governmental sources. And then we have an extensive review process using other expert advisors and regional specialists in terms of going through and finalizing the numbers each year. So how do China and Taiwan perform? Well, Freedom House, and I had to go back through some of the historical data myself for this, and it's very interesting. But we've assessed both China and Taiwan since the indexes start in 1973. And, for those familiar, back then, both were rated not free. But the trajectory soon started diverging. By 1976, Taiwan had already transitioned to be rated partly free, and since 1996, it's been rated free. Today, and you really see this in the data, Taiwan is one of the freest countries in Asia and even in the world. It scores a 94 out of 100 points, alongside countries like Iceland, Estonia, and Germany. For context, the US scores only an 83 out of 100, so Taiwan is doing better than us. China, by contrast, is one of the least free. It scores a mere 9 points out of 100, and of course is rated not free. But when you look at the data from the past 15 years, you really see that divergence between the two and how it's widened. Because China's score has dropped 8 points since 2007, and Taiwan's has increased by 5. So China, about a little over a decade ago, was already at a 17 out of 100, which is pretty bad. If your kid got that score in school, you wouldn't be too happy with that. And it was already deeply repressive, and it's dropped almost by half. And so I think that's also, and I think we'll probably hear from some of the folks talking about the business environment, is something that's been very palpable. I just wanted to say a few words about Hong Kong and then some of the implications. So, and I did not know this, but we've actually been assessing Hong Kong as a territory since the 1970s as well. First under British and then PRC control. And throughout this period, Hong Kong has been rated as partly free. It has a particularly low score in political rights because of the lack of universal suffrage and increasingly strong CCP influence, but it long retained a pretty strong score on civil liberties. That's changed in the past 15 years and particularly the past 5. Hong Kong's total score has dropped 24 points since 2007, and 18 of those have been in the past 5 years. It's now around a little less than half, around a 43, and very close to being designated not free for the first time. So a few thoughts and implications, then I'll wrap up because I know there's a lot still to talk about. As you can see from this data, and I think from a lot of other observations, China is ruled by a profoundly authoritarian regime, one that has become more restrictive and less respectful of citizens' rights over the past decade, even as its global influence has expanded. And so we now face a situation, an unprecedented one, where the world's second largest economy is governed by one of its most authoritarian regimes. The situation on Hong Kong has shown a new set of challenges when you look at the dramatic backsliding there. Taiwan, by contrast, has emerged as a beacon of democracy and freedom, despite its international isolation and exclusion from the United Nations. Taiwanese civil society, lawyers, journalists, and policymakers have taken serious and genuine measures to expand and protect political rights and civil liberties, despite fierce political polarization, economic reprisals from China, and a barrage of disinformation campaigns from the PRC. And actually, I'm working on another index and a new project that I direct called Beijing's Global Media Influence, whose report we published in September. And we looked at the way in which Beijing was influencing media in 30 countries. We included Taiwan in that set. Not surprisingly, Taiwan emerged as facing the highest degree of CCP influence efforts, but also the highest score for resilience and response. And I think that outcome alone can really offer inspiration and hope as the world grapples with the challenges posed by the increasingly repressive rule of the Communist Party in China. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Anthony, maybe we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Kim. I'm truly delighted to be here with you all today. I mean, what a fantastic 5 independent organizations coming together to talk about important subject. The Heritage Foundation, we've been producing this annual Index of Economic Freedom since 1995. So it's not just an annual exercise to put together numbers and all that. By the way, today's theme, this title of the event is By the Numbers. I'm not here, given 7 minutes, I'm not here to torture you with the numbers. I want to share, I want to possibly entertain with some thoughts, and we're going to have some action. Why? Because when you come to the Heritage Foundation next time, you will see our vision statement. We want to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. I'll repeat, freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society. I think this is why we are here together. This is why these 5 independent organizations in Washington, D.C. were kind of united. We also want to build Taiwan or Ghana or Ukraine where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. That's the key frame. That's the key concept we want to promote through this annual Index of Economic Freedom. You see wonderful index covers over the years. And we cover 4 major areas of policy discussion: rule of law, regulatory efficiency, open markets, and limited government. Under these 4 pillars, we delve into specific variable, as you can see here, property rights to labor freedom to financial freedom. All 12 components are equally weighted so that we don't bias towards one dimension or the other. I highlighted earlier the rule of law, but because nowadays, more than ever, the rule of law is more important than ever. But in our index methodology, we do not differentiate the importance of rule of law against some other factors and pillars. I just want to show you the country coverage here. So this is directly from our index book. And as you can see, we have many countries. We have from Singapore down to North Korea. These are the countries we grade in our annual Index of Economic Freedom. This is 177 countries, sovereign countries. We used to cover and rank Hong Kong, but in our view, Hong Kong is not a country anymore, not a territory. This is a city of China. So there's no independent policy making, whether political or economic, and we dropped the Hong Kong 2 years ago to reflect that reality. But you may wonder why then economic freedom? Why does it matter? We talked about political freedom thanks to Sarah, but now when we talk about economic freedom, what's the utility of economic freedom, you may ask? So I just want to share some simple charts here. As you can see, economic freedom is not some abstract concept. This is something very meaningful, very powerful. If you look at the relationship between economic freedom and GDP per capita, prosperity, you see high positive correlation. Also, if you look at the change, the economic freedom increases, growth rate comes well as well. So China, despite its shortcomings and all that, if you look at China's economic trajectory over the past 20 years, you will see bit by bit China has been growing. But the key question becomes, how can they sustain that without really bringing real institutional reform? So what we are trying to do is not really rocket science. We want to try best available proxy for our discussion, conversation based on real information, factual information. This is another dimension, the importance of economic freedom and some other independent variable. Nowadays, we talk about ESG, environmental issues, climate change. If you are really interested in ESG and environmental climate change challenges, we have to focus on how to improve economic freedom because that is the engine of innovation. Without innovation, how can we take care of the environment? How can we be really a resilient economy? And this is another dimension. If you're talking about education, health, and also the overall per capita GDP in terms of prosperity, you see definitely high correlation. So this is not really one-dimensional financial means or economic life. Economic freedom is really about overall well-being when it comes down to education, access, life expectancy, and health, and even political freedom. There's a high correlation between economic freedom and political freedom. Now I'm coming back to this chart, the ranking or performance chart we have, from Singapore #1 down to North Korea 177, because I wanted to show the distance between China and Taiwan. I cannot even put together these two countries together. So you see Taiwan, #6 in the world, China down there, 158. I have to cut down the remaining countries below to see the distance between Taiwan and China. But why? It's the same people. It's not far from each other. Taiwan is a very small country, right? And China big, but the difference is very, very concrete and measurable. Because Taiwan is open, transparent, accountable. It adopts freedom, policies based on freedom, openness. China, unfortunately, they are not really doing that. They are just toying with the concept of free trade. It's been one-way approach, and that's why we see this huge difference when it comes down to ratings concerning economic freedom. Taiwan is #6, and China is 154. As you can see, the 80.1 versus score 48 is quite a difference. Now, more visually, I just want to show you why Taiwan and China, they are so different. Here, green color or yellowish, they are relatively okay color. Dark green is good color. Look at China, a lot of red. It's not because of the color of their flag. I mean, look at the rule of law, basically. The institutional shortcomings. I mean, this is not something we can help. This has to come from China. And we only hope that people in China, they have opportunity to demand greater accountability and transparency, openness. But as we know, as of last week, President Xi Jinping is a king of Xi Jinping now because he has solidified his power based on his royalist and many other things. So that's an unfortunate reality. And again, this is not a political statement. As you can see, all the publicly available numbers, if you put together, you see this stark difference, contrast between Taiwan and China. Taiwan minus China, in a simple mathematical terms, that's freedom. And as we can tell, more than any time in our history, freedom matters, and that's why we're going to keep continuing this publication. Next year's will be our 29th edition of the index. We're so happy that our message can be amplified by other organizations like Atlantic Council, CIPE, World Bank, and many others, obviously Freedom House. So to me, this is just a one-time discussion item. Obviously, we're going to have greater challenges. We're going to have to continue to work together, but this is really time to work together among like-minded, willing partners. So I'm excited, and that's the direction we want to head together. Last but not least, if you're really interested in numbers, and again, I told you I'm not going to torture you, so just come to the Heritage Foundation website. You can get all the data from our index website. So we'll continue the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anthony. And I think a lot to dig into there in the discussion, so I hope the audience is already thinking of questions. Taya, over to you.
Thank you, David. Shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk now about women's rights as prescribed by the law. It is critical to ensure that the business environment treats women on equal footing with men. In fact, after many years of research, we know that a regulatory environment that encourages and incentivizes women's economic participation can have a great benefit for economic and development outcomes. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law report, which has been producing data for the last 12 years, but we created an index 4 years ago, and I'll tell you a little bit about it and how China and Taiwan perform on this index. So a little bit about what we measure. For more than a decade, we have set out to identify where exactly laws are preventing women from starting businesses and contributing to their economies. The project started in 2008 as part of a wider World Bank effort to increase and deepen the research on how investment and regulatory investment climate impacts women. What we found was that many barriers that women face actually happen before their point of actually starting a business. And this is why we decided to produce this unique index, which focuses on a woman's interaction with the law as she enters, progresses, and ends her career. The unit of measure here is a woman, and the 8 indicators that you see on this slide follow how the law impacts women at different stages of her working life. As she enters the workforce, her rights in the workplace, laws that mandate women's pay, what happens when women get married, have children, all the way to when they retire. What we found in our research that it's important to understand how the law treats women as both employees and entrepreneurs, and also within the private sphere of their life. Their freedom of movement within their country and internationally, and also their ability to remain in the workforce after they get married and have children. This is from our latest report, which came out last March. We found that the global average in the world is 76.5 out of 100, meaning that women on average have 3/4 of the rights of men. But this global average hides a lot of variation both between regions and within regions. And every line you see here is a country within this region and its score. The two regions that are furthest behind are Middle East and North Africa, and South Asia, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia and the Pacific. And there's a lot of work to be done to advance gender equality in all of these countries. In 86 countries, women face some form of legal job restriction, shutting them out of many high-paying jobs, such as in transport, manufacturing, construction, water, energy, or mining. And even if they can do the same jobs as men, in 95 countries, women are not guaranteed equal pay. We hope that this report will accelerate progress towards this important area. It's shocking that in 2022, we still have so many discriminatory laws that are preventing women from equally participating in their economies. But to turn to the topic of today's discussion, which is China, you see here the orange circles are China's score on the overall index and in each of the indicators, compared to the East Asia and Pacific region and the global average. As you can see, in some of the indicators, China achieves a perfect score of 100 over 100. These 8 indicators, behind them are 35 questions grouped to about 4 or 5 questions per each indicator. And you see where there's the most room to improve is on women's pay and women's pension. Currently, there is no law mandating equal remuneration for work of equal value in China. And also, women cannot work in the same jobs and industries as men. In particular, they cannot work in mining or water industry. When it comes to pension, the ages are unequal at which men and women can and must retire. And the difference is quite large. Women must retire at 50 and men at 60. Now, women often take time off because of having children from the workforce, and then if they also have to retire later, the period that they work is much smaller. If they're also paid less, then that leaves them in a very financially difficult situation, and they tend to live longer. So we see a lot more women poor at an older age because of this. We also find that people are not really promoted as they near retirement. So if women are retiring at 50, their progression within their careers is also slowed down. So these are the 2 areas where there's really the most room to improve: equalizing retirement ages and reducing the number of restrictions on women's work. When it comes to Taiwan, the picture looks much better. The overall score is 91.3, and 6 of the 8 indicators achieve a perfect score. But there is still some room to improve, and that is related to parenthood, also in entrepreneurship and pension. In Taiwan, the employer bears the full cost of maternity benefits, which can sometimes be a disincentive for employers to hire women, and that's the area where they can improve. They also do not prohibit discrimination based on gender when it comes to access to finance. And when it comes to retirement, years taken to take care of children are not accounted for in their pensions. Now, there are only 12 countries in our index that score 100 out of 100, and that means that there's 178 countries where women are not treated equally in the law. That leaves 2.4 billion women that don't have equal opportunities to participate in their economies and contribute to the growth of their countries. We did a big research effort a few years ago to recalculate our index all the way back to 1970, looking at the laws that we could find. And this allows us not only to see where countries stand today, but how they have progressed over the last 50 years. And as you can see from this chart, there has been progress everywhere, but it has been very slow and very uneven. You see a big shift both in Taiwan and China in the late 90s and early 2000s. But for the last 7 or 8 years, there have been no reforms at all in this sphere. And overall, the global average, as I said, has increased from 45.6 in 1970 to 76.5. But this is a very slow pace for 50 years. And these issues are not really controversial. They're about giving women equal opportunities to participate in the economy. And so we hope that the data and the evidence and the research that we have will help make the case for those working in these countries to really accelerate the pace of reform. If you'd like to download our dissemination package, you can scan this QR code. On our website, we have data and underlying data for all of the countries. We also have evidence and analysis that links this index to outcomes that really matter for both human rights and economic development. Thank you.
Thanks, Taya. I think, I'm struck as you were talking by the fact that we come out of this Party Congress in China with a Politburo in China that's now made up of 24 men, no woman on the Politburo, first time since 1997.
Wow.
And then, of course, in contrast, in the theme of this event today with President Tsai Ing-wen leading Taiwan. So maybe when we get into the conversation, we can talk about the implications of that for, the kind of the leadership of countries and what that means for equality, gender equality in countries. Eric, over to you.
Great. Thanks, and happy to be here today to share the stage with such great institutional partners and colleagues here in Washington, D.C. I think that CIPE's index might be the newest on the block here. CIPE has been working at the intersection of markets and democracies for the past 40 years. And our primary constituents are working with chambers of commerce, business associations, and economic think tanks throughout the world on business reform issues, making economies more inclusive and deliver more accountable ways for more citizens. This corruption risk forecast is the product of a close collaboration with the Hertie School in Berlin. And we've developed this over the past more than a year to essentially use data in a way to project outward. So this has two primary audiences. The first audience being an academic audience or a practitioner audience in the anti-corruption sector that is looking to improve governance, but in new and different ways. The second audience is for businesses that are looking to invest in fixed capital investments, long-term investments, and to take a look at the historical trend lines in order to project out and see what to expect down the line. Using the corruption risk forecast, we have 30 different indicators grouped into these indices and a forecast. The Index of Public Integrity, it assesses the capacity to control corruption and ensure that public resources are spent with integrity. Unfortunately, for both China and Taiwan, due to certain gaps in open government partnerships, reporting metrics, we are not able to produce a fully robust IPI, or Index of Public Integrity, for either country. So this is a gap that we do hope that both China and Taiwan address in the future. We also have a transparency index, which is looking at government transparency based on different kinds of public information and services the country to offer their citizens, both de jure and de facto sets of transparency. And within the corruption risk forecast, you'll actually see links to each of the indicators. So if there's a public land cadastre, there'll be a link to that within the corruption risk forecast. If there is a system of public declaration of judgments, there'll be links to that within the corruption risk forecast as well. All of this produces and flows into the corruption risk forecast, which is built into objective indicators looking at a period from 2008 through 2020, which is the last full set of data that we have. COVID has interrupted the data collection, and we hope to get more data and fill in the index as we go forward. So again, who is responsible? We're here at CIPE, here in Washington, D.C., and also the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building. This is based out of the Hertie School in Berlin, and it's a team of researchers that is really looking at anti-corruption practitioners and focusing on how they might change the dialogue around anti-corruption programming. So moving beyond naming and shaming or public governance reform and into new and innovative models to fight corruption and improve transparency and accountability around public finances and private investment. If we look at a comparison between China and Taiwan with the Transparency Index, we can see here that we forecast that China will be stationary over the next several years. that it ranks in a middling manner within Asia. And we compare that with Taiwan, which has an improving transparency trend and more publicly available data to more people. We project out that this will allow citizens in Taiwan to better assess the responsibility and accountability of their government, allows civil society to have more of a voice in the process, and holds public governance, public stewards of public finances more accountable. If we then go to the corruption forecast, looking at China and Taiwan, we see China as a middling, again, country, where they are not really moving forward or backward. Again, if you look down in the lower right-hand quadrant here, we don't have a lot of data to rely on when we're making this corruption risk forecast. Again, this is a dearth of data coming out of Taiwan, and coming out of China, and it's only getting worse. If we look at Taiwan, we have a number of data points to look at on judicial independence and press freedom. Press freedom is kind of middling, but judicial independence is moving forward. And we do think that corruption is on the downward trend, and accountability and transparency metrics within Taiwan will allow the country and the civil society to hold public officials more accountable moving forward. So the last point here, where is the data? And with China in particular, when I was putting this presentation together, it's really difficult to pull a lot of the public data because there is just none. We see the public data becoming increasingly scarce. I pulled up a recent Financial Times article that indicates that publicly available data on the economy is on a downward trend. We see from Xi Jinping's remarks at the recent committee meeting that security is now in the driver's seat over economic performance. And we see a divergence between Taiwan and China, where Taiwan is disclosing more and more information, allowing for greater government accountability, while China is closing down, and we see a greater reluctance to disclose any data. And really, this is a test, to my mind, for markets and transparency. So we have, within China now, certain data that is restricted due to security concerns and SOEs which may have access to that data. And we have a private sector within China that, due to those security concerns, does not have access. And as Drucker once said famously, that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so now we have a private sector that's producing microchips or chicken sandwiches. And if I don't have access to data to forecast where my business will go, where I need to invest, at what point in time in the production process I need to put that capital, how am I going to invest and create greater wealth and greater opportunity within China? So these are some big questions that we see coming out. We look forward at CIPE to hosting an event at the International Anti-Corruption Conference here in December. And we do have a forthcoming paper on Hong Kong after the investment security law, which should be released within the next couple weeks. Within that paper, not to give any spoilers, we do find that Hong Kong, after the security law, has had a significant decline in international capital and is acting more as a window for China to get out into the world rather than for international investors to come into China. So the flow has indeed reversed. And with that, I will stop.
Great, thanks, Eric. I think that point about opacity and the difficulty of getting data is probably relevant to everyone here in terms of their measurements and their indexes. So maybe we'll come back to that point as well in the discussion. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, David. So I'm Dan Gray. I'm representing Atlantic Council. We have a freedom index and a prosperity index, and I would like to start by thanking CIPE and being co-organizer with us. Thank you very much, Andrew, for your opening remarks. I enjoyed very much working with Eric here, and I see Greg in the audience. We have great plans to work together. And I also want to thank representatives of great indexes which helped our indexes get going. So if you pick up the report, and there are reports on the outside, at the table at the exit there. By the way, we are getting paid by the piece, so if you buy those things, it would be great. It will help us. You will see in the acknowledgement section that we give thanks to Heritage and to Anthony by name, actually, and his boss, Jim Carafano. We are thanking Freedom House. Amy Slipowitz, Sarah, you're getting thanked by proxy. And at the World Bank, Thea is mentioned by name, and 4 other of her colleagues. So what we've built in partnership with the other indexes. We are not competing. We are here on the same mission to get facts and discuss facts and figures. What are we going to do today? We are going I'm going to provide a description of the Freedom and Prosperity Indexes. We'll talk about the results for China and Taiwan specifically, and we'll have a broader perspective of the results that we are showing. So we have two indexes, Freedom Index and the Prosperity Index. The Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council is dedicated to the exploration of the question of the relationship between freedom and prosperity. And we heard Anthony talk about how in his index, he looks at the results of his index and he creates correlations with different things. Well, we decided to create a complete index that captures some of those things. So then we look at the relationship between these two indexes. So the Freedom Index has 3 sub-indexes. We have a freedom, a political freedom index, where we are analyzing some of the same things that Freedom House's Freedom Index analyzes, but in less detail, less depth. And we have several sources of the data, Freedom House, World Justice Project among them. We have an economic freedom sub-index in which we look at some of the same things that as Heritage, and we have some of our data from Heritage, the World Bank Group, Fraser, and the Credendo Group. The one thing that we did that we find very productive in this discussion is to create something that we call the Legal Freedom Index, where we are looking at judicial effectiveness, state capacity, order and securities, things of that sort. It's legal freedom, it's not justice. We're looking here at the institutions of a country. Is there soundness in how the economic freedom and political freedom is being administered? And here we have a variety of sources also, including Freedom House, World Justice Project, Fund for Peace, etc. And then we have a prosperity index. What we thought was very, very important was to measure more than GDP per capita. We think it's very important to define prosperity broadly. We do measure income, but we also measure the environment. We measure health. We measure happiness. We think people should be happy. And we also measure minority rights. And for some of these things, we have proxies that are more or less perfect, because everyone who works with indexes knows that you can have the greatest intention of what you want to measure, but you also need to be realistic in, do you have for a certain indicator data for 174 countries and for a number of years? So we are measuring 15 years going back for 174 countries. So these are the 2 indexes that we created. We have sub-indexes, indicators, we collect the numbers, and then we create a score. And with the score, we put countries in categories. So here we are showing you the prosperity index. We were intimidated that Freedom House is here, so we didn't show the freedom index, which of course yours would be much more complex and famous and all that. So we divide countries in the freedom index, free, mostly unfree, and unfree, in prosperity, prosperous, mostly unprosperous. So we have that, and then we have also a rank. And then we have a map and the same hierarchy of colors showing countries in the different categories. So now let's look at China. So what are we seeing at China? What we see for China is that for the Freedom Index and for the Prosperity Index, China is in the using our categories, where we go 100 to 75 is free or prosperous, 75 to 50, 52. So it's by the score. Using these categories in the indexes, China is mostly unfree, second category from the bottom, and mostly unprosperous. But I would propose to also look at the rank. So if you take 174 countries divided by 4 and you end up with quartiles for this, you will see that in terms of freedom in total, China is in the bottom category among the countries of the world. Sorry, not the bottom category, the bottom quartile. Economic freedom, bottom quartile. Political freedom, bottom quartile. Legal freedom, it is in the second from the top, right? Second quartile. In legal freedom, again, we measure the strength of the institutions. They rank very well, for example, in order and security. In the Prosperity Index, the overall rank puts China in the third quartile at 114. In income, it's in the second from the top. In environment, second from the top. Let me add to this on environment. We all hear about lots of pollution in China. The way we measure environment is using quality of the water, using a measurement from NASA as a proxy. This is a very basic measurement. So on that, China is doing well. We'll come back to minority rights. On health, it is in the second from the top, and in happiness, it's about middling. The one measurement in which China ranks extremely poorly, out of 174 countries, 167, it is minority rights, which measures religious freedom. Not surprising, given the treatment of the Uyghur minority. Now, looking at Taiwan, it looks very pretty, sort of like a mint leaf, you know, peppermint leaf, very pretty. Okay, so whichever way you cut it, it's in the top category. If you look at our categories, free, mostly free, etc., or if you look at quartiles, dividing 174 by 4, it is free. I'm sorry, correction. It is mostly prosperous. If you look at the score for the prosperity score, it is 73. It almost made it in the top category. The cutting level was 75. So it is at the very top of the second category. But in freedom, top category for economic freedom, political freedom, legal freedom, in political freedom is number 8 in the world, according to our measurements. In minority rights, stark contrast to communist China, it ranks number 4 in the world. But let me tell you this about our index. It was easy for us to find correlation. So our correlation between the Freedom Index and the Prosperity Index is 0.81. Which is about as high as you want to be, because if you are at 1, it means you're measuring the same thing on both sides, and then what's the point of having the measurement, right? So, but we are very, very interested in figuring out the direction of causation. We are exploring the question of, does freedom lead to prosperity? Do you need to be free to be prosperous? That's what we are really interested in our work. So, one thing that we decided to do to test this is to look at discontinuity moments in history and to see how countries who were in one point in such a moment, how they performed from there. So we looked at East and West Germany, North and South Korea, and the PRC, Taiwan, and Hong Kong over time. So if you look at the East and West Germany analysis, what we did was we looked at 1950. All of Germany had been devastated by the war. You had two countries, East and West Germany, that had a difference between the GDP per capita of the two countries of 1.5 times. And then there was the discontinuity. West Germany became democratic and capitalist, and East Germany was ruled by the Communist Party of East Germany from 1950 to the reunification of Germany in 1990. By the time of the reunification, the discrepancy between the GDP per capita of the two parts of Germany was 3.6 times. If you go to the right, we have North and South Korea. They both were very poor at the end of the Second World War. For a while, they were both autocratic. In North Korea, you had the communist government. In South Korea, you had the military dictatorship. But South Korea was capitalist. So democracy started in South Korea in 1980. So by 1980, the delta between GDP per capita of the two was 2.7 times. So after 1980, South Korea was both capitalist and democratic, and today the difference between the two of them is 51 times. So let's look at China. GNI per capita this time. You'll notice GDP, GNI. We do this just to keep you on your toes, to make sure you pay attention. If it's the same thing, then you get bored and don't pay attention. You don't read. Okay, so GNI per capita. Mao era, end of the Second World War, a poor country, and it stayed poor for a long time in the Mao years. Then in 1980, you have the Deng Xiaoping reforms, and they start catching steam, and then you have this tremendous success that we all know and admire with China. But it could have been a lot better. If you look at Taiwan and Hong Kong, you see that Hong Kong and Taiwan grew much faster, especially after 1973, when Taiwan became democratic. And as was discussed before, there were always elements of democracy in Hong Kong. One more interesting thing. I'm praising the World Bank only because Thea is here, otherwise I wouldn't say. So economists at the World Bank came up with a very interesting concept that we here refer to very often as the middle income trap. So what they define by that is it started with an observation that a lot of countries over the decades were able to move from the low income category to the middle income category, but didn't make it over the hurdle to the high income category. They looked as if they were trapped in the middle income category. So therefore the term middle income trap, which sounds very ominous, but it's just that. So if you look, and every year the World Bank tells you what that level is, and they measure it by GNI per capita. And today it is 13,205. And guess what? China has not gotten out of the middle income trap today. But if you look in history, you will notice that Hong Kong escaped it in the 70s, and Taiwan escaped it in the 80s. So what does this all mean? I want to be very careful with the terminology. I'm not here to present you any definitive proof of the direction of causality. But we can say that our work indicates that free countries tend to be more prosperous than unfree countries. And again, let me remind you, because I was talking actually with David before on the definition of prosperity, it's not GDP per capita the way we look at it. We have a broad definition, a holistic view, beyond just wealth. We think about prosperity as the well-being in a society. Is this a society that creates conditions for human flourishing? Is this a country in which people want to live? And if you look at that, While we recognize the many successes of the PRC in increasing its GDP per capita, when we compare their results and the results of free Taiwan and partly free Hong Kong, we cannot but wonder how much more the people of China could have accomplished if they had been free without the Cultural Revolution and its re-education camps and without the concentration camps in Xinjiang today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's a really important point to kind of end on, because I know that a lot of folks probably are thinking as they look at some of these indexes, well, China has, it's the world's second largest economy now, isn't it? Isn't it prosperous? But defining our terms and kind of thinking through what that means is, I think, really helpful and can spark some more debate about these indexes. So I thank you for those great presentations. I think 5 different indexes and a lot of different aspects that we can dig into now in the conversation. I'll welcome the audience to raise their hands if they have questions, but I want to start, I think kind of where you left us, Dan, and also maybe for Anthony as well. I noticed that in both of your indexes, Singapore actually does relatively well, right? So in the Heritage list, it's, I think, #1 in economic freedom. In the Atlantic Council list, it's an authoritarian country, obviously, but one of the most prosperous in the world. So maybe just, whenever we have this conversation about democracy, authoritarianism, and prosperity and economic success, and whether it makes sense to split the world up as the Biden administration arguably is doing into democracies, autocracies, Singapore is always kind of one of those things hanging out there that is hard to categorize and deal with, right, in that way. So maybe we just open it up to you, Anthony, if you want to kick things off, and then see if anyone else has thoughts on that.
Thank you, David. That's one of the important yet standard question we often get. By the way, through my snapshot presentation, I wanted to make sure that really what matters is, once again, freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society. They are all interlinked. And that's what we are trying to convey, why these variables, freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society, they are so important in terms of ingredient. When it comes down to Singapore, this is not a lazy excuse, but our index is really about economic dimension. So David, your fundamental question is really, Singapore is quite small, open, global financial economic hub, but when it comes down to Singaporean political system, you may say something very different. Singapore is not really a full-blown democracy. They have their own internal constraint. But again, this is not like an excuse we are trying to convey. We intentionally design and build our index focusing on economic freedom side. But when you visit Singapore, you will see the vibrant, discussion, civil society dimensions, freedom, opportunity, and prosperity to a really high level. So that's the kind of the setting we are. But of course, we can talk about, as Professor Negria mentioned, the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom is undeniable. I mean, the question becomes which one comes first, but without the fundamental pillars of openness, transparency, all civil society functions, we cannot really sustain this symbiotic relationship between political freedom and economic freedom. And I think that Singapore will show a unique example, because Singapore is also going through its own kind of internal soul searching, what will be the future of its political system. So I think we have a real live example in front of our eyes.
Interesting. Dan, go.
So David gave me an easy question because we're at the same organization. We're both at the Atlantic Council. And the reason why it's easy, we discussed the case of Taiwan in our report of last year. Here is where we came out on it. The question is, can a country without political freedom maintain economic prosperity when you introduce the arbitrariness of a government that is unelected? And by the way, let me make this point, which is very important. Until now, I talked about numbers and data. There are no numbers and data here. It's a personal opinion, but it's something that we discussed. The PRC used to grow at 10%. It is now projected next year to grow at 4.4%. Not all of it, but part of it is due to the fact that the economic freedom reforms of Deng Xiaoping are being reversed under Xi Jinping. And one of the things that they do is now they put a member of the Communist Party on the board of directors of every company, and introducing a political influence in the economic process. But coming back to Singapore, Singapore doesn't have this. Doesn't have this because the founder of modern Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, was a genius. Henry Kissinger picked 6 great people of the 20th century, and Lee Kuan Yew is one of them. So if you want to bet your country's future on having a genius as your leader time after time after time, good luck. Also, if you want to have an authoritarian system to rule your country, if it's 5 million, sort of the size of the large city in the US, you're doing fine. If you have 1.4 billion, I still wonder how Xi Jinping thinks about this. 1.4 billion and one man and makes all the key decisions. Tough to do. So that's where we came out on the Singapore. It introduces the presumption that you're going to, and by the way, since Lee Kuan Yew, they've had 2 other prime ministers, excellent. Mm-hmm. But do you bet that you will always have excellent leaders? That's the question.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other kind of overarching question I wanted to ask is, these are all very, interesting, useful indexes for those who are researchers and those who want to dig into the data and get a better sense of how to make these comparisons. My question would be, what is, for each of you, the intended audience for these indexes, right? What is it that you hope, who is it that you really hope is digging into this, and what change potentially do you hope to affect by doing this work? And so I'd open that up to everyone, but maybe start with those who've kind of had some newer indexes. So maybe we could start with you, Eric, since I know your corruption index is relatively new, and then turn to anyone else who wants to address that.
Yeah, so the primary audience that we were thinking of is 2 primary audiences. The first audience is anti-corruption practitioners, and so anti-corruption is everywhere within Washington these days, and in the West in general. But to this point, it's a lot about naming and shaming. It's about investigative journalism, digging into the data, digging out into individual cases. And so what our intent was here was to show the systemic risks and systemic nature of corruption, and to expose governance gaps in order to begin to address them as anti-corruption practitioners. It's really interesting, and it's a great story, and it's a great read to read through these articles and in the Atlantic or in the Washington Post or whatever news source of your choice is. But at the end of the day, that's only one small insulated case. Our objective here is to look at a systemic risk of corruption and begin to address that through anti-corruption and good governance. The second audience is really investors. So investors in the private equity world, investors that are making long-term bets on fixed capital investments that will take a decade to pay off. We wanted to give them a snapshot of the direction that nations were taking through their policies and adoption of good governance over a period of more than a decade.
Okay. Sarah, did you want to answer that question?
Sure. Since we have a really old index, about a decade and a half old index, and a brand new one.
Exactly.
I think, when you look at freedom in the world, it's been around for so long, and I think it has many different audiences. And I think there's also this element, which is, I think, very interesting. There's who uses the individual country assessments, and then the interest in the overall global trends, especially when you created the index each year. You can say, look, this is the trajectory of democracy. These are the regions of the world that are and countries where there's progress, and this is where there's backsliding happening. And I think it's those global findings that really get a lot of attention, both for all the indices, for freedom in the world, for freedom on the net, and the new China one we did. So I think that's kind of top level to just really inform the public and public debate. I think when you get to like the policymaker level and individual countries, we hear from civil society activists that it can be very helpful for them. I mean, the purpose is that it's research, but it is also, there is that element of galvanizing change. I think trying to point out in particular countries, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are maybe, competition regionally? Ooh, we want to be the top of our region, and we're the best. And there's bragging rights for some governments and others. But we also hear civil society activists using that, being able to go to their government and say, like, look, this is an area that, our score could improve or our score declined. And they say that it can be very helpful to that. I mean, I think the other thing I would say is honestly also how the index gets used. So actually the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example, a lot of investment firms who do ESG investments end up using, say, as well as fellow indices like Dan's new index, the data from other indices. But I think with the MCC or investment, then the numbers become money. And so we actually have governments reaching out to ask, sometimes less sincerely, sometimes more sincerely, how they can improve their score so that they could be, maybe more eligible for an MCC compact for foreign assistance funding. And so that kind of in terms of that good governance conditionality can be really important when in some of these indices are used, for either by investors or say by donors. To incentivize better governance.
Great. Did anyone else want to answer that?
Yeah,
Taya, go ahead.
I can come in. I resonate a lot with everything that's been said already. I think, Women Business in the Law Index looks at laws, and laws are under the direct purview of governments. So I would say our primary audience is governments or policymakers that can change those laws. Women are half of the world's population, but in 178 countries, they're not treated equally. So this really, there's a lot of people that can influence that change. So like Sarah said, civil society has used our data in their advocacy. The MCC also uses it in their Gender in the Economy scorecard. Researchers use it to make stronger cases for gender equality, both on human rights grounds, but also on economic grounds. So I think we've had lots of different audiences using the data, but primary audience is really those that can influence the change and change the laws.
Just quickly, I think we're all on the same page, but I want to share something quick. When we were designing and trying to come up with our first index back in 1995, we had a very specific policy objective. Back then, foreign assistance was a big thing in Washington, D.C. USAID, helping other countries, kind of giving out money. But we thought that United States foreign policy in terms of assistance can be more effective because ultimately, it should be homegrown, it should be bottom-up, rather than making our friends overseas dependent on US government program. So that was the beginning. And I think that over the past 28 years, I think we've been achieving a lot of things. Not only MCC, but USAID, they are now using our index, for example, for their self-sufficiency, vote for self-sufficiency, and a lot of others are using it. So we didn't have really targeted audience, but it's really good that, like many other partners and organizations we have today, more people are coming to realize this is a really important policy tool, not only in terms of investment, but many other things. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a really concrete progress we all collectively making.
Great. Dan, you want to add?
So our focus are developing countries. We didn't even want to look at Eastern Europe. We felt they're doing well enough. Now with the war in Ukraine, we decided to focus on Eastern Europe. What we want to do is we want to give decision makers in developing countries who are in government tools, sort of along the lines of what Sarah was talking about. We want to make the case that you need freedom to achieve prosperity. And when they say, well, how do I increase freedom? I say, well, you have economic freedom, political freedom, legal freedom. Here are some of the levers that you can move to improve the prosperity of your country. At the same time, we want to give tools also to activists in developing countries. So they can go to their government and they say, look, you are at 132. How about we do a little bit better? So and you can change the following things. So that's how we are thinking about our audience.
Okay. Taya, I want to ask you a question related to what we were kind of mentioned at the beginning, which is the relevance of how a country is led and the ability of women to be the leaders of countries and what that means for equality, gender equality in countries, and the follow-on effects that come from that. Do you see any correlation there? It's certainly, as I mentioned, kind of relevant to the China-Taiwan conversation, but I'm sure it's relevant to what happens in lots of other countries.
No, absolutely. We see a very positive correlation between countries that legislate equality and a number of women in leadership positions in politics. We did a correlation a couple of years ago with number of women in parliaments and our index, and we found a very strong positive correlation. Now, we don't know which way the causation goes. Is it when more women are in parliament, they legislate better, or that more equal laws lead to more women being able to get to that place? So we don't know enough about that yet, and I think that's an area of research that really we need to do more on, to understand what comes first and what really leads to this change. We have this 50 years of data that shows where change has happened, when, on what. What we need to understand is what led to those countries focusing on those issues in that particular period of time. So I think some of these other data sources out here that show what happened politically, economically, can really help us understand more what motivates change.
That's interesting. The more information on that, the better, I think.
Yeah.
Sarah, I wanted to go back to you. You mentioned Freedom House also publishes an annual assessment of internet freedom in several dozen countries. Can you talk a little bit more about how China and Taiwan perform in that space specifically?
Sure. So the Freedom on the Net Index also has a score of, say, out of 100, and it looks at a number of different areas. One set of scores relates to access to technologies, and so there, for example, China does score relatively better in certain ways, but also not as well as you might think in others because of, say, urban-rural gaps or other restrictions that are placed on connectivity. And then there's limits on content or the way in which content is regulated. Of course, China scores very poorly there. And then the respect or violation of user rights, and China actually has like no points in that section. So on the index for internet freedom, China scores also only a 10 out of 100, and it was actually ranked as the worst performer of the 70 or 75 countries for the 8th year in a row in the version that the edition that we just published last year. So I think the Chinese government has really, that's not surprising, but been really at the forefront of designing the toolkit and implementing how to suppress internet freedom, and I think has contributed to some of the global declines that we see. But China's last in that set of countries. Taiwan, on the other hand, scores a 79 out of 100. And I didn't double check, but I'm pretty sure the U.S. is also below it on that one. And then in Taiwan, obviously it's a very open, free internet. It's one of the freest in Asia. You do still have on the books some things like criminal defamation and some other criminal penalties for certain online, activities. And so that's something that's not really a best practice. And so even though there aren't a lot of cases under those laws. And then they lost a point last year for something that was kind of a mistake, but apparently the government blocked a cryptocurrency exchange and news platform. It was then reversed, but in terms of the way the methodology worked, they got docked the point. But last year it was a flat 70-point difference between China and Taiwan. And so we don't assess Hong Kong there, but I think if we had, you would have seen Hong Kong a few years ago much closer to where Taiwan is, and now really rapidly dropping in terms of prosecution, starting to see takedowns and things like that. So I think that's one of the spaces also with Hong Kong that has really deteriorated in the last couple of years.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, well, it's not great that it's deteriorating, but the data from Freedom on the Net, I think, is just incredibly valuable, and also looking at the way in which China's model is being kind of replicated and being promoted in developing countries around the world. I think the fact that Freedom on the Net digs into that is really, really useful. I just want to ask one more question from me for the panel, and then we'll open up to questions, which is, and Eric, you kind of touched on this, but the information scarcity in these countries, China being a prime example, where you have limited freedom and openness, right? How do you currently, across these different indexes, deal with that when you're looking at countries that are not free? How do you expect to have to deal with it in the future? And then maybe because of where we're holding this event at the National Press Club, what is the role of the media in trying to push forward? How would you want the media to use these indexes, but also what is the role of the media in perhaps ensuring that there's data that you can actually use to continue this important work that you're all doing? So maybe, Eric, I'll start with you if you want to add to your comments.
Sure, yeah. Look, to have a robust market, you need open data. You need access to information, and the security first focus of China and what they're doing now is really limiting, our ability to develop this corruption risk forecast in order to deploy it and compare apples to apples. Again, back to Andrew's opening remarks, we're trying to make a good faith analysis here between two different economies or economies within the world. And if we don't have access to that data, if we don't have access to information and like-for-like matrices, then we aren't able to conduct that analysis. And then, you have a press that's, being suppressed and that does not have the ability to report on this because many of these indicators are now subject to national security provisions. Mm-hmm. So even if you would report on these metrics, then you are subject to criminal penalties, imprisonment, and we do see this being exported. So we have seen in our corrosive capital work state-owned enterprise contracts being subject to national security provisions within the recipient country. So now we have a third country where journalists cannot really dig into the data on the commercial terms of this transaction. And that hurts the overall private sector and the market and their ability to react to these investments.
Makes sense. Anyone else want to add on that?
I'll just convert this question slightly to a technical kind of question because it's one thing that we produce annual index, but the key question becomes how do we maintain our credibility and objectivity? I mean, you can just say, I'm playing darts, okay, China is 25, Taiwan, I love you, so I'll give you 75. That's not what we do, obviously. And as a Washington-based organization, we cannot possibly travel to each and every one of these 177 countries we cover. We have to come up with a very consistent, objective, reliable way of measuring good governance, especially good economic governance. So we tend to rely on international organizations' data, IMF and World Bank, because they have an important role to play, not only in terms of bailing out or assisting other countries with a foreign aid. Their ultimate goal, in my view, is how to really expose bad practice and enhance transparency in our global economic system. So we rely on their numbers. Obviously, we are the consumer and watchers of those international organizations. I think that's one unique way of really monitoring China as well. I mean, I cannot just wait for China's submission of here's a very nice, tidy economic freedom data you should use. We don't do that. But because of other things we talked about, MCC and other countries' PR dimension, we get a lot of emails and phone calls for a private meeting. But we gently say, we're here to listen to your story, but we cannot really utilize your data because it has to be cross-checked. We have to be consistent for our methodology and everything. So bottom line, it's an important dimension, but I want to highlight that this is really about promoting transparency and good governance, either economic or political, whatever system. That's the focus of this kind of index business, in my view.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's obviously essential to maintaining the legitimacy of these indexes so that it's understood that it truly is based upon that kind of measurement. Taya, go ahead.
I could answer that question as well. So the Women Business and the Law Index is based on the law, as I said. And so what we do, we also have local experts in 190 economies, and we ask them to point us to the right laws that then we look at and evaluate. So for now, it's just a purely de jure index. We are looking at how to measure practice as well, and for that, there will be more subjectivity around that. But for now, we rely sort of on written rules. But we also rely on the media to highlight these messages, and every year we have we have an index that is now annual. We come out every year in March, right before International Women's Day, and we rely on media to amplify these messages and really highlight how slow progress has been in the last few years.
Well, I don't want to be the only one who doesn't say anything, because then people wonder, why doesn't he say anything about it? So we are measuring 28 different indicators, and we have 15 different sources of data. So sort of along the lines of what Anthony was saying, we rely on data from sources that we trust, and we have a diversity of sources. Thank you.
Can I just add on to that, Dan? How do you measure happiness? I'm very interested.
There is a United Nations measurement.
There is, okay.
And it's done together with Jeffrey Sachs. I mean, the creator is Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard.
Okay.
And it's based on interviews in countries. And yeah.
Okay. Sarah, anything to add there or no?
No, I think it'll be good to leave some time for questions from Mark.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir. I think we have a microphone coming to you.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Ms. Cook, can you shed some light on how you deal with the liberal-leaning censorship by the social media oligarchs, which surely has to hurt the U.S. Freedom picture? And secondly, y'all, does any of you sort of have the courage to do a parallel study on prosperity versus religion, which would shine an equally valid Klieg light on the human condition?
Sarah, do you
So
want to take that?
I'll be honest, I have not looked at the U.S. report that closely. You can find the U.S. report both for Freedom in the World and for Freedom on the Net. I think in some cases I don't know if the score changed, or there's certainly mention there of kind of moderation policies of technology companies, whether they're proportionate, whether they're open, whether they're transparent, and some of these same principles that we've been talking about. So you can look at that there. And then I would say in terms of the religious question, I mean, freedom of religion is one of the indicators that we look at on freedom in the world. And in fact, one of the places I think was mentioned here, China does very poorly on, and Taiwan actually has a quite diverse and robust religion community.
Religion.
Does anyone else want to, thanks, Sarah. Does anyone else want to answer that, the kind of relationship between religion and freedom in these indexes?
Yeah, I think I'm doing the same thing I'm mentioning. I'm measuring freedom of religion as part of prosperity. But I would love to talk to you afterwards and understand what you're trying to do, because we are looking at prosperity. I'm very interested. So let's have a conversation afterwards. I'm very interested, sir. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
But I want to add, though, I think you are raising an important dimension here, because to me, freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, they are the input, and prosperity is output. But what you are raising here is, I see religion as one of the input, factor. But if we can have a variable, you say religion, but if we have some kind of database that shows 100-something countries, or even less, 70-something country, like a religion-based some sort of the index, we can have a definitely better answer to your question in terms of the relationship between good governance, either political or economic, and religion. But we don't have that database yet.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to one of my questions. I'm curious if anyone wants to answer this, which is, these are difficult endeavors that you're all diving into, or have been diving into for a while in the case of Heritage and Freedom House and also the World Bank. What are the biggest challenges that you face in putting these indexes together? And I would say, going forward, as you think through where the world is heading, we already talked about the opacity challenge, we've talked about some other challenges. What are some of the kind of roadblocks that you need to deal with currently and are expecting to deal with in the future as you continue to put these indexes together?
So in what we are trying to do, which is figuring out causality, is going back in time. Because we now have data for 15 years, but we are measuring slow-moving indicators. The health measurements in a country don't change from year to year. Mm-hmm. So we want to look at, as I was saying before, moments of discontinuity. And there are some countries, for example, you look at India, it ranks very well on freedom, but doesn't rank well in prosperity. But we believe that if we go into the data longer than 15 years, we may see moments in time where there was a change from a more statist approach to the Indian economy to a more free enterprise approach to the Indian economy. But we need to go back in time. So now for next year, we will have data for 25 years comparable, but you need 50 years. So Joseph Lemoine and Yomna Gaffer, who are my colleagues here, and James, we are going to put together a database that is 50 years, and then we can do better work on causality.
Okay. Anyone else?
We can give you some advice on that because we did that 3 years ago. We looked historically, and I think the biggest challenge is finding the data, and I think that was mentioned earlier. For us, we base our index now on the laws, but we know increasingly that practice matters much more than what's on the books, and social norms, which religion can be part of that, really influences the uptake of some of these rights. And so how to influence those and how to understand how those influence legislation is something that we're grappling with right now, how to measure.
If I may just quickly, I think, again, we're on the same page, but I must say that we are more interested in what's ahead of us than what's behind us. So rather than becoming a lagging indicator, we try to be leading indicator, trying to offer some more kind of concrete and practical assessment in terms of what's ahead of us, but that's not easy. And also second portion of that is that, index is not really kind of political tool. This is a policy tool, but over the past years, I think to a certain degree, this kind of index, either Heritage Index or some others, it has become a political tool in terms of discussion. And also, I have to say it here because I have a tremendous respect for what you are doing. Certain indexes has become the victim of political discussion and political kind of football in a way, because we need a more transparency, we need a more practical policy tool we can compare and contrast so that we can really bring real changes into countries like China. But obviously the Heritage Foundation, without budget, we cannot do what World Bank is able to do. So echoing your point, I think probably the biggest challenge is how we can continue in a consistent way to secure good data, quality data. I'm not talking about quantity. We got to focus on real quality on the assessment and data, and thus good discussion.
Yeah, question here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Tina Chong from Voice of America's China branch. My question is to Ms. Tia. I'd like to know, because you're talking about good data and quality data, I'm just wondering, because you list Taiwan under China, Taiwan, China. So I'm just wondering, since Taiwan is not a member of the World Bank, how do you get quality data from Taiwan? Is it totally separate from China? I mean, the sources. Thank you.
Yes, so our sources are from the private sector. It's professionals in those economies and countries that answer our questionnaires and point us to the laws of their country. And we measure the laws that are relevant to the main business city. So we look at Taipei and we look at Shanghai, not the entire country themselves. And the source is the actual written law, but sometimes we need to get it from some people in the country. Yeah.
Great. We have time probably for one more question if we have any questions in the audience. Otherwise, I'll turn to our panel to see if anyone has a kind of a final word on their index and how they think it relates, not just to the China-Taiwan question at this moment where we see China heading more in an authoritarian, even more hardline authoritarian direction, and Taiwan seemingly headed in the right direction. Any final comments or thoughts?
Well, I think it's wonderful that these organizations got together to compare notes. And I want to propose that we do it again. And we should also add two organizations from Europe, Legatum and Bertelsmann, who have a yet different approach to how this should be done. I think there is a very important role for being factual rather than emotional about these things, and we can make our point much, much better by being factual.
If I may, I think the reason we are here today is really we want to bring real, measurable, concrete, positive change into China. We are not praying for the collapse of China. That will be a disaster. It'll be a nightmare. I cannot imagine how we can do things in Indo-Pacific with fragile and chaotic China. China is not a Singapore. It's a big guy, and we got to make sure that we have real tool in terms of transforming China into somebody like Taiwan. So this is the journey we're going to do together.
Well, I think that's a good way to close. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to thank our fantastic panel, and really, as has been said, bringing these 5 organizations together to discuss and compare these indices, I think, has been a really useful exercise. So stay tuned. These indices will continue to produce interesting results, and I think it's been a really great conversation this afternoon. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.